Jamie Metzl is a partner in the global investment company Cranemere and is a senior fellow at the Asia Society. He is a recognized expert on Southeast Asian history and politics and has extensive experience, including service in the White House, at the Department of State, and for the United States Senate. Please welcome Jamie Metzl. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I've so loved hearing from the other speakers and learning so much, and it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with all of you. So thank you for choosing to spend this day with us. And I think a number of us, I live in New York, had a bit of trouble getting here as a result of Storm Nemo. So I was supposed to fly out on Friday afternoon, and then that flight was canceled. We moved it to Friday morning, and then that flight was canceled. So woke up around 5, and we drove to Philadelphia, and then I needed to go home to Kansas City for a reason I'll tell you in a moment. We flew to Minneapolis, missed our connection there, and then got back to Kansas City on Saturday morning at about 1:30 a.m., and at 5:30 a.m., woke up and competed in an ultra-marathon with 13,000-foot elevation change. So if I'm a little tired and ragged, please forgive me. It's not my fault. But we're here talking about these major changes that are happening in the world. And one of them that we discussed this morning was the internet. But really, one of the most important transformations of our lifetime is the rise of China. And China is rising economically, but it's also rising in terms of its role in the world. And it's also rising in terms of its proportion of our mental space. So many of the speakers today have talked about China because in any field in which anybody operates, China and Asia more broadly is an increasingly important factor. So my talk is about how rising China is changing itself and changing the world, but also how we need to think a bit differently about China and the world as a result of China's rise. And there are two kind of extreme schools, people who say that Chinese growth will be linear from here to eternity, and there are people who are saying, well, it's all a house of cards, there's all kinds of debt and structural problems, and this whole China thing will collapse. And the truth is somewhere in between. China has huge, some say unlimited potential, but it also has monumental problems that it's going to need to face, and some of which we're going to talk about today. So the summary is, trees don't grow to the sky, but in most cases, they continue to grow, and certainly that's what we're going to be seeing in China. And I like to talk with reference to these two, let me see if these two ships. This first one, the larger one, is a treasure ship, which was one of 300 ships in an armada that went around the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean in the beginning of the 15th century, 80 years before Columbus, led by Admiral Zheng He. And there were 300 ships and 3,000 men. This smaller ship is the Santa Maria, 80 years later, part of 3 ships and 90 men that crossed the Atlantic and, as you know, discovered the New World. From a Chinese perspective, this ship represents this great civilization, and certainly for the 1,000 years from the 6th to the 16th century, Asia, particularly China and India, were the wealthiest parts of the world, in many ways the most advanced parts of the world. This little ship, from a Western perspective, represents Western moxie and innovation, and the changes in thinking in the West that started with the Renaissance and led through industrialization that allowed people in the West to take the kind of risks that were required to take a little boat and to go off of the known map. And so when we think about Asia, when we think about Asia's changing role in the world, we also need to think about mental maps. We have our Western mental maps, but certainly people in China and people in Asia have their own, and we may have sometimes conflicting narratives. And all of these narratives, in many ways, are driven by economic factors. As I mentioned, for the 10,000 years before the 6th century, the West, including the Middle East, was more advanced than the East. But for this 1,000 years, from about 600 to about 1600, look at this is China and India. But beginning with the Renaissance and then going here through industrialization, Europe came to have growing economies and begin to play the dominant role that created much of the modern world as we know it. And part of that was planting these Enlightenment seeds here in the United States that became this country. But part of that was thinking about those broad principles that were European principles, specific European concepts of the role of the state, of state sovereignty, of rule of law. And then those became, through the power of European economies and militaries, those became universal principles. And in the series of world wars in the beginning of the 20th century, those European concepts of absolute state sovereignty and nationalism came in some ways to their logical conclusion, which was destructive war that harmed the whole world. And in the aftermath of the war, when the world was in shambles, only essentially the United States had the productive power to build, in many ways, the modern world, the world that we live in today, which is defined by the US economy and the US and the role in the world that that US economic strength has generated. You know, this little blue color is the US. So look, in 1970, how dominant that is for the rest of the world. And the world that we live in today is that world. It's a world of open markets, of global standards, of free navigation, of individual rights. And this doesn't mean that it's perfect, but there is this whole system in many ways guaranteed by the United States and guaranteed by the United States Armed Forces. But at the same time that this Western story was happening, there was a parallel story of Asia's economic growth, starting with Japan. In the 50s and 60s, it began to gain steam. And then in the 70s and 80s, the four Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, a little bit after, learning from the Japanese model. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping started the reform process in China. And then in 1990, under enormous pressure from the World Bank in a payments crisis, India began its reformation process. And since then, since 1979, China has had, on average, 10% per year growth. And to put that in historical perspective, in the 50 years between the end of the Civil War in the United States and the beginning of World War I, which is a period of explosive growth for us, the US economy grew 7 times. In the 34 years since Deng Xiaoping's reform in 1979, the Chinese economy has grown 11 times. So it's this rapid rise. And there's a debate about when the Chinese economy will surpass America's. This chart is an OECD estimate based on purchasing power parity, which suggests that by 2016, China, by PPP terms, will have a stronger economy than the United States. But still, at that time, the US economy will be 70 times larger than the Chinese. In the CIA and the World Bank estimate that by around 2030, the Chinese economy will be larger than the US economy. Still, at that time, per capita will be 4 times bigger. But the basic trend line and the power and the ability, as we've talked about a moment ago, to define norms based on economic power, that is moving in the direction of China. But there's a problem, because the Chinese government doesn't have the kind of inherent legitimacy that is afforded to governments in a democratic system. And in order to maintain their legitimacy, they need to prove it in a way. I mean, in addition to using force, but they also need to prove it to the Chinese people that they can maintain that role. And they do it in 3 means. One is through establishing their link to the Chinese Revolution. 2 is by positioning themselves as the stewards of China's economic growth and delivering that growth. And number 3 is by being seen as and being champions of Chinese nationalism. So for the first, I'm sure many of you have been to Tiananmen Square, and you see the picture of Mao. And I'm sure many of you, like me, wonder, what's Mao doing there? There was a book that came out last year that made the case that Mao was responsible for 45 million deaths in China during China's Great Leap Forward. Even the Chinese government official position is that Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. Why is he there? The reason he's there is because if there's no Mao, if the current government doesn't trace its authority to Mao and the Chinese Revolution, then there's a big question of what are they doing there. The second legitimator is economic growth. And as you know, as I mentioned before, China's economic growth has been astounding. But even more important is how that economic growth has translated into poverty reduction, with over 400 million people being brought out of dire poverty over the last 3 decades. And it's really remarkable. But like in any government, in any country, the question is, what have you done for me lately? And there's a lot of pressure on the Chinese government to deliver economic growth. But as they do that, they are running into a fundamental problem, which is that their economy, as currently organized, is in many ways not sustainable for a number of reasons. One, an over-reliance on exports and fixed investment, and under-reliance on consumption. Two, overcapacity. They have huge gluts of inventory. They have 64 million empty apartments. Three, the state is too powerful, and the state-owned enterprises are sucking up all of the energy in the economy, and certainly most of the capital. Repressed consumption, corruption, one of the most corrupt big countries in the world, massive inequality. In the United States, the top 1% of the population, forgive me, many of you, control 60% of the country's economy. I'm sorry, it's the top 5% in the US, control 60% of the economy. In China, it's the top 1% controls 60% of the economy. So far more unequal than here. Massive waste of resources because the resources are mispriced, and we talked about that a little bit earlier today. Huge environmental damage. 70% of rivers are polluted, 90% of aquifers, and 99% of air. It doesn't live up to EU environmental standards. And a middle income trap of rising wages, but they haven't yet created an innovation society. And as you see here, with the GDP numbers going up, this line, the red line of perceived quality of life, is staying stagnant. So the country is getting richer, but the average Chinese doesn't feel that they are benefiting from that, and that's because of inequality, corruption, and environmental damage. And so there's a list of needed reforms that are relatively clear for rolling back the power of the state, creating a green economy, increasing consumption, which is hugely suppressed in China, enhancing rule of law, market pricing resources. And China's leaders, who are really smart people, they know this. In the 12th five-year plan that came out a year and a half ago, it's a great blueprint for what China needs to do. Last year, there was a report that a Chinese-connected think tank produced with the World Bank that lays out, it's a great report. So there is a blueprint, but the problem is it's very, very difficult for China to do it. And the reason, this is what I call China's reform conundrum, has 2 parts. First, if reform is going to happen, there are 2 ways it can happen: top down or bottom up. So this guy here, everybody know who this is? Yes. So Bo Xilai, last year it came out that he had amassed a fortune of $160 million, that he was associated with corruption, that his wife was connected with the murder of a British businessman. And when all of that came out, and when it could no longer be suppressed in the Chinese and international media because his chief of police had sought asylum in the US consulate in Chengdu, the party had a choice. Could they say this is one guy gone rogue? Or would they say that there's a systemic problem of corruption, and we're going to address that? They made the first choice. They personalized it for him, even though when I talk to my Chinese friends, I say, name one person, a part of the Chinese Politburo, whose extended family are not worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. I've yet to receive a single name. Last year, the New York Times came out with a report that Premier Wen Jiabao's family, extended family, was worth almost $3 billion. The next day, their website was shut down. Bloomberg last year came out with a report that Xi Jinping, the current head of the party, that his family was worth $1 billion. They got shut down. And so it's very hard to think how reform is going to happen from the top down when the people on the top are so benefiting from the many problems in the system. But if it can't happen from top down, then what about from bottom up? This guy, I think you all know, Cheng Guangcheng, he was the blind, self-trained lawyer who was standing up for poor people in his home province who's had their land stolen with environmental damage, forced abortions. and he was very brutally suppressed, and he escaped and is now in New York. These people are people whose children died, or they would say were killed, when their schools that they were in collapsed during the Sichuan earthquake, and the quality of construction was terrible because money had been siphoned off of these projects for corruption. The same thing, the people who were protesting the environmental damage of the Three Gorges Dam, all suppressed. So if it can't go top down, can't go bottom up, the question is, where does it come from? China's new leaders, this is Xi Jinping, Li Keqiang, they're good, smart guys, and they may even have very good intentions. But the question will be, are they willing to break the number of eggs that need to be broken? Because the level of rot at the highest level of the Chinese economy, and the economy and government are so closely interlinked, is extremely high. So there are these kinds of pressures, structural pressures in the economy. China also has huge pressures. They have huge natural resource shortfall. For pretty much every resource that they need, other than human resources, they don't have enough of it. They don't have enough water. They don't have enough oil. They don't even have enough coal. They don't have enough food. All of those things they need to import. And so beginning in 2001, they started this thing called their going out policy, and where they have mostly state-owned enterprises who are going and kind of grabbing up resources, and you read about this in places like Africa and Latin America. There certainly are going to be many more acquisitions of US companies as part of this, and there's nothing wrong with it. But the way that many of these companies has behaved in many parts of the world has been very aggressive, in many cases without a lot of concern for rule of law, and certainly increasing levels of corruption. And from the Chinese perspective, because they need to bring in so many resources, they fear this vulnerability, that their need for resources is greater than their ability to protect the provision of those resources. And so, for example, so much of their oil comes through the Straits of Malacca, which is between Singapore and Indonesia, and they feel if push came to shove, the US Navy could shut them down. And that's one of the reasons that China has made and is making a massive investment in its military. 10 years ago, the Chinese military budget was $20 billion a year. Last year, it was $120 billion a year, and it's going up in step. And granted, our defense budget is far, far bigger, but the kinds of things that they are investing in are asymmetric capabilities designed to counter us. Anti-carrier ballistic missiles, anti-satellite weapons, building aircraft carriers designed to increase their presence first in the Western Pacific and then globally. And the reason why this is causing alarm bells around the region is because of some of China's behavior that I'll mention in a moment, but also because they're doing it without a lot of transparency and without clarity about their intentions. And while this is happening, this connects to the third source of the legitimacy of the Chinese government, which is positioning themselves as the champions of Chinese nationalism. And particularly after Tiananmen, when there was a crisis of legitimacy, the government has determined that they are always going to be the ones seen as championing China's role in the world, which is why in every one of these border disputes that we'll talk about in a moment, the position is we will not give 1 inch. And you see these kind of popular protesters, but I see those as in many ways government sanctioned, because you don't see Tibetan freedom, Tibetan independence protests in China. You don't see Xinjiang protests, but you do see all these ultra-nationalist protests, which makes you think that they are being sanctioned. And so these three things, China's nationalism, its need for resources, and its growing military capabilities, are coming together in a very dangerous mix in Asia, and where there are a number of not just these crises brewing in the South China Sea. China has basically claimed almost the entire South China Sea as its own in total contravention of international law, and is currently occupying. There was a standoff last year between China and the Philippines in a place called Scarborough Shoal, which is, I believe, in Philippine waters. It's 100 miles from Philippines and 500 miles from China, but it's now being militarily occupied by the Chinese. So the Filipinos and the Vietnamese and 4 other countries are really worried because they feel that their territorial waters are being aggressively claimed by the Chinese. These are the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. I think you've seen a lot of that. China is claiming them. Over the last 3 months, China has violated Japanese airspace over 100 times. That means 100 times there was a violation where Japanese jets were scrambled. Last week, a Chinese military ship locked its radar on a Japanese ship and a Japanese helicopter in Japanese territory. And what that means is if you're a naval commander and the radar is locked on your ship, you have a few seconds to decide if you're going to fire at the source of that radar or not. And you're putting your entire life on the line. And so it's an extremely dangerous situation. In many ways, the Chinese are making these claims, one, because there are huge natural resources in both of these areas, but two, because I believe there's a long-term desire to push the United States further out from the Western Pacific, and they're challenging the United States' two closest allies, particularly Philippines and Japan. At the same time, there's a massive, and I don't mean to be alarmist, and I really love and respect China, but the Chinese government, I think we need to be honest in the conversation about what's happening. Just a massive government-led effort of cyber espionage. There was a report that came out a month ago that said that 1/3 of all global cyber attacks are coming out of China. 13 US intelligence agencies last year, a year and a half ago, put out a report calling China the world's biggest and most persistent government engaging in cyber espionage. And the way a lot of it is working is Chinese government-sponsored entities attacking US corporations, stealing intellectual property, and giving it to Chinese state-owned enterprises. So the theft of US intellectual property is in the tens and some say hundreds of billions of dollars per year. Nuclear, again, China has made some progress, but the major proliferation of these last decades, particularly through Pakistan, but also to North Korea, and in some ways to Iran, has been helped along by China, and certainly China has stood in the way of more forceful responses to this nuclearization of the region. On environment, Mark earlier talked about the amazing things that China is doing internally, and they get huge credit for that. But in terms of negotiating an international agreement that everybody signs on to, China has certainly been dragging its feet, and we can talk more about that in the break if people have questions. On human rights issues, if we look at Syria today, where China and Russia are blocking in many ways more responsive actions. North Korea, which is a human rights disaster being propped up by China. And the basic point, and I don't mean to be too negative, but the basic point as I see it is this, that we live in this world that is in many ways this post-war world that has been created in part and in lead part by the United States. And it's a huge statement. We should all be delighted that China is rising because bringing these people out of poverty, because the entire post-war system is designed as an open architecture in order to allow people, allow countries to emerge. But at the same time, as China emerges, because of its strength and because of its size, if it doesn't buy into the international system, no matter what its intentions are, it will undermine that system. And what we're seeing is exactly that. And so China, as I see it, has three options. One is to say we support the US-led system. Two, to say we support part and we have questions, and here's what we're going to do to address those questions. And three, to say we have a different model and here's what it is, and we can talk about that. But to do neither and to try to game the system, I think I think my slides have been cut off, I think. So I will just say just a few final reflections. And I could go on forever about this, so I'm glad that they are giving me the cue. Is that the world's center of gravity is shifting from over Europe, where it was for a very long time, to over the Atlantic, to over the United States, and now it's over the Pacific. And we aren't ready for that. They aren't ready for that. And there's going to be a very painful transition from here to there. And so part of that is that China needs to take more responsibility, certainly more than they are showing. And part of that is we need to recognize that we live in a far more competitive world than we've ever lived in before. And all of the things that the previous speakers have talked about are things that we need to do. But perhaps most importantly, we need to have ways of all coming together and to agree on what the common rules of the road are and how we can work together in constructive ways. And when there is that kind of space, we need to do everything we can to build upon it. And if there are areas where there's conflict, and there will be, we need just to be honest with ourselves and honest with our partners. So, again, I could go on forever, and I would look forward to continuing this conversation with anyone who wants during the break. Thank you very much.